Some people are drawn to the law, others are drawn to the mind behind the crime. Kerrie Droban Zhivago is both. An award-winning true crime author, a capital litigator, an investigative journalist who stood face to face with the worst of humanity and refused to look away. I sit down with our on-air co-host, Kerrie Droban Zhivago, to trace the road that led her into the courtroom, defending the line between life and death, and into the pages of some of the most haunting true crime narratives of our time. We explore what shaped her, what drives her, and the questions that keep her writing, litigating, and listening long after most would look away. We talk about justice, not as a verdict, but as a pursuit, about the human mind and what bends it, what breaks it, and what redeems it, and about the cost of standing in a room where truth is decided. This is Kerrie Droban in her own words.
Yeah, I was really looking forward to it, especially for our audiences, just to get to know you better and really understand who you are. Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you. Thanks
for
for doing this, because I'd like to understand more about who I am.
Well, let's dive deep into it.
It's funny because I think that I define myself the way that I define a lot of people that I'm researching or investigating, which is basically from the origin story. Now, I'm really fascinated by where people came from, how they evolved into the person that they are, because I believe that every experience, good or bad, shapes us, influences us, empowers us, inspires us. And those are certainly true for me, because I think that looking back on, my origin story, I'm definitely everything in my life suddenly makes sense of why I have this, burning, passionate desire to know the truth about people, about myself, about what is identity. I mean, those are all of the questions that I think have shaped my life. And that's probably a really circuitous way of answering your question, which is, who am I? I feel like that story where there's this, I think it's a duck. I'm going to get this wrong. I think it's the ugly duckling, where they go around asking, "Are you my mother? Are you my mother?" And that's kind of sometimes how I feel, because I feel like I've lived many lifetimes in one lifetime just because of the experiences that I've had. And I think that just when you get to a certain level, like in career, for example, you start to reflect back on, how did I get here? And all of the people that helped you get to where you got, because it's a team effort. So I mean, that's really how I define myself as a mother. I'm always mindful of, what am I putting out into the world? How am I showing up? And what do I want that legacy to be?
Yes. Well, I would say as a colleague, you're leaving quite the legacy out here. You're able to just look deeper and see beyond what is their image of a person. And I feel like what that person wants to project, you're able to go deeper into that. Not really kind of, but you do. And so I just love that about you. And when you speak on identity, I'm over here just I'm kind of staring off into the distance. But it's there's so many different ways that you can be defined and shaped depending on what stage of your life you're in. I feel like life begins over and over again. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think identity is fluid sometimes. Well, speaking for me, I feel like it's fluid because I am always evolving based on the knowledge that I'm gaining. And I think if I was to put myself, in a fixed state in time, I know there are a lot of people that, for example, will define themselves by their age, 20, I need to do X, Y, Z. By 30, I need to have 5 babies and whatever. And I've never done that. I've never seen life like that, compartmentalized like that, or in segments. I've always seen it as very fluid. And so wherever you are in your life, whatever knowledge you're gaining is how you evolve as a person. So I've always found that fascinating. And it's one of the areas I'm definitely interested in, pathology, why people do what they do, what shapes them, what is that toxic cocktail that led them to the place in their life, if I'm speaking about criminal minds, right? And I think because it is a fascinating question, that's really what has driven me in so much of my career and my writing is, what is it that makes up this person? Why do they do the things they do? And it's not just one thing. It's a composite of many things. So people are multi-layered. And I think that's why I choose to see people in layers. And I like to dig beneath the surface of it. And it's kind of ironic, actually, because in dealing with psychopaths, of course, they don't have that depth They're
Right.
very surfacey. And I think that's part of the fascination for me is that, they almost are born, well, I believe they're born one-dimensional. They don't
Yes.
have those layers. They're just a mirror. And they're reflecting back to you what they perceive that you need at that time, which is usually whatever your vulnerability is portraying. So I think that's part of that fascination of why I have gravitated toward the very darkest pathology. Why are they so different? How did they become that way? Or what, were they born that way? So those are those questions, that I'm always striving to answer. It's a little deep for Tuesday morning.
I love it. Let's keep going. I mean, Kerrie, getting into what shaped your perspective early on, is there a defining influence that was early in your life that really made you who you are today?
Yeah, I think that I had many experiences more than people that have defined my career path and my writing path. And I really only gained this perspective by looking backwards. I mean, it certainly wasn't something that I just jumped into, so like, because I'm always fascinated by the origin story. So, my influences the experiences that influenced me were growing up in a very secretive family, a family where their identities were not known to me until, I was practically a grown woman. And so, I lived in a world where things were not what they seemed or what they appeared, and people were not what they seemed or appeared. And so it was like this duality that really led me to question my own experiences and the idea of what's real, what's not real, what is the truth of something. And so I think just having that background and that perspective and growing up in that kind of world, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. It's a dysfunction, whether it's, an absentee parent or, a substance abuse or a crime that happens. It's that same sort of like, almost like you're growing up in an alter reality. Like, okay, what's real, what's not? And I think that can be very destabilizing for a child. And so I think it led me into this quest. I kind of think of it as a quest of, I want to know the truth about people. I want to know why they do the things they do, why they abuse. And it is a kind of, and so I did wind up getting into dangerous relationships, studying dangerous people as a capital lawyer, as a writer of true crime. So I think that all of those experiences as a kid really influenced me. But there was one that I think was a huge turning point in my life. I mean, I had pursued an acting career when I was much younger, and I really, really thought that I wanted to be an actress. And what a perfect segue from the kind of life I grew up in to wanting to be somebody else, right? wanting to act in another world, which is very ironic. Of course it wasn't, premeditated, but in looking back, it's very ironic that was the career that I wanted to do, right? It was to be other people. And so I wound up in an acting class where Edward Albee was visiting. He was a visiting professor, and he asked us to write a scene and perform it, and of course I was a huge fan of Edward Albee's work and, thought I was going to be really clever and write a scene for him and act it. And he pulled me aside afterwards, after all the other my student friends left. He goes, I think that you should really focus on being behind the scenes. So, at the time, I found it somewhat devastating at the time. So here's a great example of how a life experience can actually be a silver lining, right? Because at the time I thought, what do you mean behind the scenes? I've been cultivating this whole persona and dream of pursuing acting. And so he's the first person really that really gave me the idea that maybe I could be a playwright. And so, but of course I didn't pursue playwriting, which is very weird. I pursued poetry. So I was a poet. Well, I am a poet, but I pursued poetry for about 6 years. Okay. So can you imagine my poor parents, right? I go from acting, nearly starving, telling them my new career goal was going to be a poet. And so then I really, really starved as a poet. And so I think that was a very long-winded answer to the question that you asked, but I think that's really the the huge person in my life that influenced me, and unknowingly, unwittingly maybe, by just that one little experience of maybe you should be behind the scenes. And that's when I started to think of writing as something that I could do passionately and and could help me to communicate and to pursue the truth about things. Because of course I went on to become a true crime writer. So I do think that all of those experiences really shaped what I later became.
Well, they definitely did. And you're one hell of a writer. I'm glad that you really zoned in on that. Even if it was in a scenario where you're like, hey, I'm trying to be up here, front and center.
Yeah.
And again, that persona, right? Especially at a young age, really trying to understand who it is that you are and how you define your image, how you are perceived in the world. And I think it's just interesting to explore that. Did you always have the tendency to question things and look deeper? Is that something that came later for you?
I think I was always a deep thinker. And I think that a lot of the way that I write came from the way that I acted too. Method acting, or method writing, as I call it, where you're getting into the heads of other people so that you can fully realize them. And so I just transferred that skill set into the written word. And so I think that I was always interested in going beneath the surface. I call it going into the lava, right? Go into the lava, find out what's there, because you can't really, I don't think, properly convey another person's life. Because of course I went on to write true crime and memoir, where I'm literally in the heads of other people, and some of who were so foreign to me and from my world. I wrote about biker gangs. And so to be able to do that, I think was really to be able to see them to kind of meet them at their humanity, their humanitarian level, and I think that's what enabled me to do sort of method writing.
Yes. So you've had an incredible career in law. What initially drew you to law?
So I wish I could say it was something really glamorous, but if I'm being honest, I wound up coming to law by a very circuitous path. So I told you I was a poet for a while, and I thought I was going to be an adjunct professor, and I had a couple of odd jobs where I was teaching creative writing to college students, but the recession hit and I could not find a job to save my life. And I was literally starving. I mean, I was eating potatoes like they were going out of style. It was like my diet of potatoes and bagels. And somebody said to me, because I was looking for work, and someone said, well, why don't you apply to be a court reporter? Because you're a really good typist. So I'm thinking to myself, why do I want to be a court reporter? Why didn't I just go be a damn lawyer? And it was a kind of a joke in my family where everybody wanted to marry me off to a lawyer. They said, why don't you go? And so I will never forget this. I thought, I'm going to be the man that they want me to marry. Like, I'm going to be that lawyer. And so that's how I wound up applying to law school. And it was kind of a crazy, spur of the moment decision. You know how most people, they plan for it. They study for the LSATs. They take the LSATs. They apply to 10 different law schools. I didn't do that. I had one law school that I could apply to before the window to applying to school for that year closed. And so it was the University of Arizona. And I didn't even think about how I was going to pay for it, how I was going to afford it. I didn't think about anything. And I just did it. It was one of those moments that crystallized for me. And I thought, I'm going to do this because if I do this, it's going to change my life. And I was at a point in my life where I needed to change. I needed to do something that was going to make me feel like I could make a change, like I could be a difference instead of just talking about it. So that's really what led me to law school. And if I'm being really honest, I absolutely hated law school. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before. And a lot of lawyers will tell you this, that they actually didn't like the academic part of law school, which surprised me because I loved academia. I loved school, and I would have stayed in school if I could make a living at it, So, but I do enjoy being a lawyer and doing the trial work part of it, because to me, that was storytelling. And in a very ironic and odd way, I mean, this is something that I've thought of much later. It was as a storyteller, you distort the truth. And so here I was getting into law because I believed in truth and justice. And yet as a storyteller, right, as a defense attorney, particularly, you're changing the narrative. You're reframing it.
Yes.
And distorting it. And so it was a bit ironic, when I came to that realization. But I think I've come full circle on that, because I went into being a lawyer. I went into the trial side of law initially. And then when I started to see, this is what really sort of was a turning point for me. I started to see victims of psychological abuse, particularly, being re-traumatized by the court system. And I started to see the courtroom as another theater, another stage. And that's when I really started to get passionate about what I was doing as a lawyer, because I realized that with that kind of knowledge and that kind of platform, there was a way to really help people navigate some of the worst times of their life and help them through the morass of the court system, which in many ways is not about truth or justice.
Yes. And that's incredible, really, to hit on that point of realization, because you're living it. You're there, again, front and center stage in these trials, really seeing what takes place. And we're supposed to be there for the victim,
Right.
But yet we're creating a system that almost enables abuse. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. I think it does. And I think a lot of it, unfortunately, so in just talking about psychological abuse, right? I mean, domestic violence, which to me is just murder in slow motion in a lot of respects. It just doesn't service the victims, I mean, I think because there isn't a vehicle in the law for it, but there isn't anything that wholeheartedly defines legally what psychological abuse is. They're always looking for that physical level because you can see it, you can measure it, you can talk about it. But for psychological abuse, which is so much a part of what a lot of the cases that I was getting involved, it was very frustrating to see that, because, by the time I would get the cases, I mean, these are the criminal cases, I was dealing with murders. And so it was very disheartening, I think, in a lot of respects, because I could see the theater going on. And I, in a lot of ways, was participating in it, because as a defense attorney, that was my job. I was an advocate for my clients. But on the flip side of that, it was really difficult to see it from the other perspective. Like, this is what happened behind the scenes that the jury never hears about and never sees.
And there's so much to a story that goes untold with that kind of a structure. And again, as a defense attorney, that better than anyone.
Yeah, it's the story that we choose to tell, but it's not the whole truth. And and that's just the nature of our legal system. And I would say, I mean, if you compare our justice system to, the rest of the world, we have an incredible justice system, but it definitely has its flaws, and it has its holes. I think as a lawyer and a writer and an investigative journalist, it's hard to reconcile the gaps sometimes. And that's where I live. I live in those gaps where I'm trying to be able to see through the games. It's sort of like a chess game when you're a trial lawyer. Everybody has the same rules. We have the same board. We can move the same pieces, but we're doing it strategically differently.
Yes. And from those early experiences, fresh off the boat of law school, I guess we'll call it, fresh off the boat, you're there and you're really trying to hone your craft as a professional in this new area. What really stands out to you? Like, was there some moments where you kind of started to understand how truth is handled within the system?
Yeah, there are a lot of defining moments for me. I think it's hard to pinpoint one exactly, but I think for me, the transition going from, I was a prosecutor originally, so going from prosecution to criminal defense to capital defense was hugely eye-opening for me, because as a capital lawyer, I think I found that the most intellectually stimulating, because here I am literally trying to understand the why of somebody's actions, right? I'm dealing with the worst of the worst, and my job is to save their life. And so I had to really I had to sort of wrap my head around, okay, if my job is to save their life, then I have to find something in their history that is redeemable, right? So something that I can show. And I'll tell you, here's a defining moment. My first case as a capital appellate lawyer was a client, and he went by the moniker, the Block Monster. Okay, so that should give you some idea of what he did. And that case lived with me for a long time. It still haunts me, but he was as a teenager himself, like he's 19, but he had murdered a witness for his trial. Okay, so he's facing the death penalty, and he had murdered her in front of her 3 children while she's reading them a bedtime story. And the bedtime story was Maurice Sendak's book, Where the Wild Things Are. And I never forgot how, just symbolic that whole scene was. And the whole time I'm writing the appellate brief and interacting with the Block Monster, I go to oral argument, and the justices ask me the one question that I am so fearful they're going to ask me. Okay, it's an obvious question, which is, why should we save him? And it literally stopped me cold. Okay, this is oral argument where you have 25 minutes to blurt out your position, right? And you've literally got buzzers in front of you that are blinking at you. And so they're blinking, the green one's blinking, blinking, blinking. And I'm like, my God, why should we save him? And so there was something that I had stumbled upon in his mitigation, in his background. And I just blurted this out, and I said, because at 12 years old, he crawled into his mother's bed and he sucked his thumb. And I remember the justices staring at me, and I thought, and in my head, I'm thinking, okay, that's the end of my law career. I'm done. I'm going to step off this podium. And so, but you know what I think that whole experience taught me was that there's some people, right? And the Block Monster may be one of them, that there isn't anything in the past, right? I mean, this was sort of my introduction to psychopathy. Maybe there is nothing. He doesn't see the distinction. And so it was a really sort of eye-opening moment for me. I have to find something, because my job as his defense attorney is to save him from the death penalty. And, and I always fall back on, I believe in the Constitution. I believe in truth and justice. I believe in redemption. But the more that I studied psychopaths, the more that I got into their pathology and the pathology of psychological abuse, I began to see this correlation of what I did not like about the justice system is this notion of second chances, rehabilitation. I know that I'm going to get a lot of flack for this as a defense attorney. I think some people do not deserve second chances. They don't deserve rehabilitation because there isn't something in their, core, components as a human being that would afford them that privilege. And so I think that's where I was really starting to feel maybe uncomfortable. Because psychopaths, I literally just wrote a book on surviving a psychopath. Psychopaths, for someone and it's very rare that they're actually diagnosed as one because they don't submit to evaluations readily. But a psychopath doesn't have those redeemable qualities. They're one-dimensional, and they mirror, and maybe they don't deserve a second chance or rehabilitation or things like that.
That's true. I don't disagree with that statement. And I think that would definitely present a moral dilemma, even for somebody of your caliber who's a lawyer and you're working these capital cases, and that ultimately that person belongs behind bars, but should they lose their life? Should the American tax dollars pay for their bullshit, so to speak, because they just continue it behind bars? Do you think that a psychopath being in general population can be more dangerous from the inside?
You mean from the inside of a prison cell or from the inside of a...
Yeah.
I think a scary part of that is that most psychopaths are not in prison. So there's that. There are what I would call the functioning or successful psychopaths that operate in everyday life, and they are your average con man, your con woman. And people stumble into them, and you when you're in the presence of one, because you start to experience them. And you start to realize that, oh my God, everything that this person just said to me is not true. But can they be dangerous in prison? Yeah, I think that to whatever extent the personality construct that they have, they're always going to be the same. So whatever they've done on the outside, they're going to do on the inside. They're obviously not going to kill if they're in prison for murder. But yeah, I mean, their core pathology doesn't change. And just to jump back for a second to your point of like the whole point of like saving killers, right, is which kind of leads to a larger issue of like, do I believe in the death penalty? I don't. And so I think that, but I don't believe in it for practical reasons more than anything, which is it's hugely expensive and it's hugely, I guess, traumatic for the surviving victims because they have to constantly be reminded and relive and rehash the tragedies that befell their loved ones. And so I think that just because it gives them a platform and it gives them a stage, the defendants, that just allows this kind of abuse to keep going. And so that's my objection to the death penalty. So, I mean, if you're going to give them, do they deserve to be in prison for life? Absolutely. Do they deserve to die? I mean, maybe if that brings about closure. But honestly, I don't think that these cases ever bring closure to the victims' families. I think these are things that live with them forever. And so I don't know that it serves a purpose. I don't know that it serves a deterrent purpose or closure or any of the other things that are sort of bandied about it for reasons why the death penalty should be in place. I mean, it sounds like justice, but I think at the end of the day, it's really prolonging the agony for victims' families and for, the strain on the system. I mean, as an appellate lawyer, I was doing death penalty appeals. So these guys would get sentenced and then 20 years later, they're still fighting. They're fighting their appeal.
Well, I love that perspective. I mean, I can't imagine being in a position that some of these families have been, these victims, and then wanting justice. But what is justice, right? I mean, what does that look like? And oftentimes, I know I've experienced one of my good friends being murdered, and I can't tell. There's such a range of emotions that you go through over time. It doesn't necessarily get easier with time when you revisit those emotions. And I can only speak for myself, but the anger comes back up. You go through these cycles, which is normal for human beings to experience that. And I feel like sometimes when people, especially when it comes to crimes against children, they're just working through complex emotions because oftentimes a person's not going to act on those feelings if they internalize them, but then they turn toward the legal system and they're like, I want the death penalty. And then ultimately, I don't think they really realize what they're signing up for with that long ride. And so I can see what you're saying about the delay of really it's just prolonging that pain. And I could see that. Is there any solution though? Oftentimes when I see how these guys sit on death row, and I understand why it is that way, but would there be another solution that you could think of to fill this gap? Or do we hold them for 20 years or do we take them out back, Kerrie? If we're really getting down to it.
Well, and I think that's really the debate is that, the whole eye for an eye mentality, which I completely understand as well. If the death penalty worked the way that supporters of the eye for an eye, if it really worked that way, then it might be a deterrent, right? Closure. It might be some finality for the suffering, but it doesn't work that way. And you're right. It's interesting to me that they're reintroducing the firing squad because, Arizona was a lethal injection state. And so the endless debate that was going on over, the ethics of lethal injection and the efficacy of it and whether it was working, whether it was creating more suffering in the defendant, it just was tying up things in court, ad infinitum. And so I think that, one of the ways of maybe combating that is making it a quick death, like they did in the old days. Back in the Wild West, if you get the death penalty, the next day you're hung or you're in the firing squad and it's done. It's a sentence that has some teeth to it. But, the way that it is now, and I don't know, honestly, what the right answer is because I will say that there are in very rare cases, but there have been cases where people have received the death penalty and they didn't do it. And so on post-conviction, their cases are overturned and they, exonerates them. And there are all of these complications that come up where you say, well, thank God the guy, didn't get the shot or, be submitted to the firing squad. So there's always that complication with our, or maybe bonus, right, with our justice system, depending on how you look at it, where somebody could actually have his life spared because of something like that. New evidence, or the witness that put him away suddenly recants. There are cases like that. So it's a very complicated issue, and it really sort of bleeds into a lot of ethic and moral boundaries. So it's hard to say.
Definitely. And it kind of comes into the arena of common misconceptions that people have about the system and about criminal behavior. And kind of touching on that, what are some common misconceptions you've seen that people have about criminal behavior?
Well, so there is something in the rule book, right? When you take a case to trial where the jury has to base their decisions on the specific act that the defendant is charged with. So in other words, they can't say once a criminal, always a criminal, right? They can't bring in the cartload of stuff where this guy maybe has like 10 dead bodies in his basement, but he's only being tried for this one. So he's not a mass murderer. He's only this one. And just as a quick aside, I had a crazy case like that once where I was appointed to handle this guy's homicide. And when I went to go interview him about the murder, he asked me which one. And so of course I couldn't say anything because everything's privileged. But that's just sort of the thing where people, that maybe it's not even a misconception. Maybe people actually believe that the person must have done a whole host of other things. But I'll tell you one misconception I think that happens quite a bit is when a client or a defendant has a right to remain silent, right? They have a right not to testify. But, there is this perception by the jury that if the client does that, he's guilty. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. There's that. Or all psychopaths must be in prison, when actually most of them are out. Or all psychopaths are killers and most of them are not. Or this is one that I think frustrates me a lot is, well, he's such a nice person. How could he actually be a wife abuser? He's the coach of the soccer team and we see him, but behind closed doors, he's like a monster, so there's all kinds of things like that go on that I think are fueled a lot too by television and the fandom surrounding crime. It's like
Yes.
Everybody, wants to be a sleuth these days and solve cases.
Yes, they do. I think the image of people can be very deceiving. We know that. They say everybody's got a secret, right? But some people that wear the mask, as we refer to as a psychopath, they're hard to detect. Even the best therapists in the world struggle with some of these guys. They're like, I never would have known. And that misconception of just who you perceive someone to be, like your priest or whoever it is, right? He's a great dad. He's always out here. I've never once seen him do anything that would make me think he was capable of hurting children. But it's
Right.
because that's a fight of... It's almost like going back to earlier, you were talking about being an actress, right? Mm-hmm. These people are on the stage of life. And when they're behind the scenes, that mask eventually slips with the ones closest to them. And those are the ones who often they take that out on, the most vulnerable, the most close to them, the person that loves them the most.
Right. It's an exploitation of trust. And you're right. They are master manipulators and master charmers, and they prey on a victim's vulnerabilities, particularly children. Children are very pliable, and so are elderly, and so are, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, women. We grow up in a culture or a society that sort of rewards women that will be demure or people-pleasing or, whatever. So we fall into these stereotypes that are ripe for predators. And I think that's the scary part of this, right? But you're right. I think if you think of a psychopath that fooled everybody, it was Ted Bundy. How many times did the media refer to him as, the all-American boy, the glamour boy, focus so much on his appearance, his attractiveness, his seduction. Many of them are very attractive because that's how they seduce their prey. So it is incredibly difficult.
It truly is. And on the screen, I'm showing Ted Bundy. He was the poster boy.
Yeah, he was.
They make him likable. it's bizarre to me that you want to make these guys likable, but that's what takes place at times in media. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. It's very much shaped by that perspective. And I think it's hard. It's cognitive dissonance. It's very hard for people to wrap their head around the fact that this very mild-mannered or charismatic or overtly handsome, Ted Bundy, overtly handsome law student could possibly be this sadistic necrophiliac. So it is really hard. And I think that that's just the way our brains are trained, where we want so much to believe in the good in a person. And they're showing us the good side. So we don't ever see what's behind the mask. But it is very creepy. And I think that you have to just, you don't want to be paranoid, but you do have to be discerning with people and question what they're telling you and dig deeper, go in for those layers, because they don't stand, they're very shallow. Psychopaths are very shallow. They have shallow emotions. And so the more that you dig deep into it, you can rattle them.
Yeah, you can. It's one of my favorite things to do. Grace, what would you say really keeps you committed to this work?
Well, I'm very passionate about the truth of things, right? I mean, I want to know what's real, and I want to know what the truth is of something. And so that keeps me investigating and digging, beyond the surface stuff of things. And so I'm always committed to that. And I'm always committed to the idea that whatever is revealed is going to lead us to that next layer of, maybe with more information, more education, you can actually affect some change.
Definitely. And how would you say that you carry the emotional weight that comes with the field that you're in?
That's a good question. It's like, I think it's really critical to have very healthy boundaries, because this work can be exhausting and mentally unsettling, but I really do keep it in sort of an intellectual sphere. Like, this is an investigation. This is a project, and I want to learn more about XYZ. I make sure that I step away from it. When I'm done with it, I step away from it. So I spend a lot of time in nature, spend a lot of time in music, and just things that will take my brain completely out of that darkness, because everything is two sides to everything, right? So you can't stay in the dark 100% of the time.
It's true. I know that all too well. That balance is incredibly important. And I think as you evolve over time, you have to also make sure that you're evolving your own plan, right, for how you decompress and how you process. Frankly, a lot of the red tape that we deal with, the inability for people to even have the emotional bandwidth to care for the victims that they serve, it seems to be something that stands out to me the most. I have a hard time processing at times. I'm like, how do you just not give a fuck? I mean, you could talk to people and they pretty much can tell you to your face, yeah, this isn't going to happen. We don't care, or whatever it is. I think evolving in that self-care and the way that you process these experiences is important.
Yeah, it's really hard not to get pulled down into sort of this emotional. I mean, I know what you're saying is it is very frustrating, because when you're passionate about something, or in the work that you do, I mean, when you have like a lead on something and you want to share that, and you want somebody else to meet you with the same enthusiasm and passion, and they mostly don't. And I think in a lot of ways, to me, that reveals just a fatigue, like a general fatigue of not having the best outlets. Because if they're so bogged down in the work that they do, because it is endless and it is difficult and sad, but you can't give up. You can't just succumb to that fatigue, because then nothing happens. Nothing gets done. And I know that, in your work, you deal a lot with cold cases, which are probably the most, in a lot of ways, the most frustrating, because they're not top of mind, they're not urgent, and you have to get beyond that thing where they're relevant again. And I think that's probably one of the most frustrating things about a lot of the work that we do.
It is. And just to touch on a few more things before we round out, I think speaking in cold cases, it's definitely one of the most challenging, and we've discussed it quite a bit on the show. People understanding the relevance of cold cases often is what gets under my skin. This is like, people will come to me and they'll say, well, my mother, she's not a high profile case, but would you still look at it? And I always say, No one is low profile to me. Every
Right.
person has value. We've talked about the ripple effect, Kerrie, many times.
Mhm.
And so I guess one of my final questions for you is, how do you personally define justice today? What does that even look like?
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting question because I've often walked away from cases or from the courtroom where I feel like justice wasn't served. And I always think justice is just us. And I think for me, you have to be that person that's willing to put the boots on the ground, that's willing to continue to do the work and show up because at the end of the day, justice is the truth to me. It's not even necessarily what's fair, but it's what's real and it's what's true. And I think that that is worth fighting for and it's worth showing up for and keeping, those cases alive.
Behind every case file is a human story. Behind every verdict, a person who carried the weight of it. Kerrie Droban Zhivago has spent her career standing in those rooms, listening to the unspeakable, defending the line between life and death, and giving voices to truths most people are too afraid to write down. Her story reminds us why Alternative I exists. Because justice doesn't move forward in silence. It moves forward when someone is willing to ask the harder questions and stay long enough to hear the answers. If this episode moved you, don't let it stop here. Visit us at thealternativei.com for full case coverage, expert insight, and exclusive content you won't find anywhere else. And subscribe to Alternative Eye on YouTube. Hit the bell, turn on the notifications, and join us as we keep pushing cases forward, one truth at a time. We're not just telling stories, we're changing the way they end. Thank you for joining us.